Ryan Miller, at just 11 years old, found the epicenter of his despair inside a two-story house being devoured by the Appalachian forest. He had forced his way through a door jammed by thick roots, stepping into a world where nature had reclaimed everything. In the middle of what was once a living room, a young sycamore tree grew defiantly toward a hole in the ceiling, its leaves dappled by the faint afternoon light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and forgotten time. Instead of fear, an overwhelming wave of grief washed over him. He collapsed onto the decaying floorboards, not from exhaustion, but from a pain too heavy for his small frame to carry. A deep, convulsive sob tore from his chest, echoing in the green-tinged silence of the ruin, a sound born from the terrifying certainty that he was about to lose the only family he had left in the entire world. This single, heartbreaking moment is the pivot upon which Ryan's entire world turns, a defining memory that would shape everything to come. We all have moments like these, turning points that change our path forever. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please take a moment to leave a comment below. If this narrative is already connecting with you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel to ensure you don't miss the rest of Ryan's journey. Your support is what allows us to continue sharing these powerful human stories, and we are deeply grateful for every person who chooses to listen and engage with us. Every interaction helps these stories find the audience they deserve, and we appreciate you being a part of this community. But to truly understand why the sight of that derelict house caused such a profound and immediate breakdown in a boy who should have been terrified, we must go back in time. The raw emotion we just witnessed was not born in that forest, but was the culmination of a slow and painful unraveling. To comprehend the depth of his sorrow and the impossible weight on his shoulders, we need to return to the morning of that very same Saturday. We must travel back to the small, cramped apartment on the edge of a struggling West Virginia town, where the fragile life Ryan Miller had fought so hard to protect was about to be irrevocably shattered, setting him on a path of desperate survival. That Saturday morning began like any other, a quiet ritual of survival in the small, cramped apartment that Ryan Miller called home. At 11 years old, he already moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older, his world confined to the two-bedroom unit on the edge of a forgotten West Virginia town. 4 years had passed since the car accident that had claimed his parents, a chasm in time that had reshaped his entire existence. He was now the sole guardian of his grandmother, and in turn she was the last remnant of his family, the only anchor he had left in a world that felt vast and indifferent. Their life was a fragile ecosystem built on routine and unspoken fears, a delicate balance he desperately tried to maintain each day, starting with the quiet task of checking his grandmother's breathing before the sun had fully risen over the Appalachian hills. His grandmother, Miss Marlene Miller, was 68, but her body was failing her with a speed that frightened Ryan. Advanced diabetes had become a relentless thief, stealing her memories, her mobility, and the vibrant spirit he remembered from just a few years ago. Some mornings she would wake up clear-eyed, telling stories of his father as a boy, her voice warm and familiar. But other times a fog of confusion would settle over her, leaving her staring blankly at the television, lost in a world Ryan couldn't reach. He loved her with a fierce, protective intensity, a love born from shared loss and mutual dependence. Yet, this love was intertwined with a constant, gnawing anxiety, the quiet dread of watching the person who was supposed to care for him slowly disappear before his very eyes. Ryan's days were a carefully orchestrated sequence of responsibilities that no child should have to bear. He was the one who navigated the small grocery store down the street, calculating every purchase to make their meager funds last. He prepared their simple meals, usually oatmeal for breakfast and canned soup for dinner, and laid out his grandmother's array of pills in a plastic organizer, double-checking the dosages he had long since memorized. His life was a silent performance of adulthood, a role he had taken on without question because the alternative was unthinkable. He did his homework at the small kitchen table while listening for any sign of distress from the other room. His childhood traded for the heavy mantle of a caregiver, a reality that had become his suffocating normal. The apartment itself seemed to hold its breath alongside them. It smelled of faded lavender from his grandmother's sachets, mixed with the sterile, medicinal scent of rubbing alcohol and insulin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that managed to cut through the grimy windows, illuminating worn-out furniture and stacks of old magazines. The television was a constant presence, its low murmur filling the silence that often stretched between them for hours. For Ryan, these four walls were both a sanctuary from the outside world and a cage that reinforced their profound isolation. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from the ancient refrigerator was a sound that belonged to their shared struggle, a soundtrack to their slow, quiet decline. Internally, Ryan had built a fortress around his own emotions. He learned early on that his fear only made his grandmother more anxious, so he became an expert at projecting a calm he rarely felt. He was a quiet, observant boy, his focus perpetually tuned to Miss Marlene's needs. At school, he was a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit, his mind always drifting back to the apartment, wondering if she had remembered to eat her lunch or if she had fallen. He had no close friends, no one to confide in. The weight of their situation was a secret he carried alone, a burden that made him feel impossibly old and profoundly separate from the other children his age, whose biggest concerns seemed to belong to another universe entirely. Poverty was a constant, unspoken character in their story. It was in the threadbare patches on his jeans, the generic labels on their canned goods, and the way Miss Marlene would turn down the heat, even on the coldest nights, to save a few dollars on the electric bill. Ryan had a small stash of $20, saved over a year from running small errands for a neighbor, a fortune he kept tucked away in a shoebox for an emergency he couldn't define but always felt was looming. He understood the precariousness of their existence in a way that was both practical and terrifying. He knew that a single unexpected expense, a broken appliance, a more expensive prescription, could be the thing that finally tipped their fragile world into chaos. There were moments that crystallized his fear into something sharp and tangible. A few nights before, he had woken up to the sound of his grandmother crying softly in her room. When he went to her, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, her eyes wide with confusion, asking for her husband who had been gone for over a decade. Ryan had gently taken her hand, his heart pounding in his chest, and guided her back to the present, reminding her who he was and where they were. He sat with her until she fell back asleep, but the incident left a chilling residue. It was a stark reminder that the disease was winning, that the woman he was fighting so hard to hold on to was slipping away from him, piece by piece. Their isolation was nearly absolute. Family was a distant concept, a collection of relatives in other states who sent a Christmas card once a year, but never called. Their neighbors in the low-income apartment building were consumed by their own struggles, offering polite nods in the hallway, but little more. Ryan and his grandmother were an island, adrift in a sea of societal indifference. He knew there were systems in place to help people, things he heard about on the news like social services, but they felt abstract and inaccessible, part of a world that had forgotten people like them. The crushing sense of being utterly alone was a constant pressure, a silent understanding that if they fell, there would be no one there to catch them. In the weeks leading up to that fateful Saturday, Ryan began to notice the small signs of acceleration. His grandmother was sleeping more, her appetite was dwindling, and there were more frequent calls from the county clinic about her blood sugar levels. He would find bills tucked away in a drawer, marked with red overdue notices. He didn't understand the specifics, but he understood the pattern. It was the feeling of standing on a shoreline and watching the tide go out, exposing all the jagged rocks that had been hidden beneath the surface. An unspoken tension filled the small apartment, a feeling that the quiet desperation they had lived with for so long was about to find its voice. Their most cherished routine was watching old black and white movies on a local channel every Friday night. It was a small slice of normalcy, a moment when they could almost forget their reality. Miss Marlene would often share memories sparked by the films, her mind momentarily clear and sharp. But the previous night she had been quiet, her gaze distant. She held an old, framed photograph of Ryan's parents, her thumb tracing their smiling faces over and over again. Ryan watched her, a lump forming in his throat. Even this simple ritual, their last bastion of shared joy, was now tinged with an overwhelming sense of finality, as if they were saying goodbye to something they had already lost. From their living room window, Ryan could see a small park where kids from the neighborhood gathered after school. He would watch them for hours, a silent observer of a life he could not join. He saw them playing tag, riding bikes, and shouting with a carefree energy that felt like a foreign language. He felt no envy, only a profound sense of separation, as if he were watching a movie about a childhood that could never be his. The window was a barrier, a clear line between his world of quiet responsibility and their world of noise, freedom, and play. He was on the inside, looking out, already a spectator to his own life. And so, the stage was set. The love between the boy and his grandmother was the heart of their world. A powerful and undeniable force, but it was a heart straining under an impossible load. The relentless progression of illness, the grinding reality of poverty, and their complete isolation had created a pressure cooker environment within the walls of that small apartment. The fragile peace they had fought so hard to maintain was about to be shattered. The morning of that Saturday was the final moment of their precarious normal. The last deep breath before the foundation of Ryan Miller's entire world would crack and give way. The fragile peace of that Saturday morning was shattered not by a shout, but by the unfamiliar crunch of tires on the gravel outside their apartment building. Ryan, who was quietly wiping down the kitchen counter, froze at the sound. Visitors were a rarity, an anomaly in their carefully contained world, and his immediate instinct was one of protective dread. He heard a car door shut, followed by footsteps on the concrete walkway, firm and purposeful. A moment later, a sharp, confident knock echoed through their small living space. He watched as his grandmother, moving slowly, went to open the door. From his vantage point in the kitchen, he couldn't see the visitor, but he could hear a woman's voice, one he vaguely recognized but couldn't place, cutting through the quiet air with an authority that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The voice belonged to Sharon Davis, a distant cousin from a neighboring county, whom Ryan had met only a handful of times at family gatherings years ago. Her tone was not unkind, but it carried a weight of painful practicality that felt far more dangerous than outright cruelty. Ryan slipped silently into the hallway, pressing his back against the cool wall just out of sight of the living room entrance. He listened as Sharon explained the reason for her unannounced visit, her words delivered in a steady, measured cadence that left no room for negotiation. She spoke of concern, of responsibility, but underneath it all, Ryan heard the unmistakable sound of a life he knew being dismantled, piece, by someone who saw their situation not as a family's struggle, but as a problem in need of a swift and efficient solution. The first blow came disguised as care. Sharon spoke of a place for Miss Marlene, a spot she had managed to secure at a church-run nursing home just outside of town. She described it as clean and well-staffed, a place where his grandmother would receive the round-the-clock medical attention she so clearly needed. From his hiding place, Ryan could hear his grandmother's breath catch a small wounded sound that was quickly followed by a weak protest. The words nursing home landed in the quiet apartment like a stone, creating ripples of dread that washed over Ryan. He envisioned his grandmother alone in a sterile room, surrounded by strangers, her familiar world of lavender sachets and old movies replaced by the cold, impersonal routine of an institution. Then came the second, more devastating blow, the one aimed directly at him. After outlining the plan for his grandmother, Sharon moved on to his own fate with the same dispassionate efficiency. He was to be placed in a county group home starting that Monday. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and terrifying. A group home. He had heard whispers about such places from kids at school, places for children with no one, warehouses for the forgotten. He wasn't just losing his grandmother. He was being erased, reclassified from a grandson and a caregiver into a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet. The separation was no longer a vague fear lurking in the shadows. It was a concrete, scheduled event, a guillotine set to fall in less than 48 hours. Sharon offered her justification, a litany of her own hardships that served to seal their fate. She spoke of her own 4 children, a mortgage she could barely afford, and a husband working 2 jobs. There was simply no room, no money, no capacity to take him in. Her voice was firm, presenting her decision not as a choice but as an unfortunate necessity, an inescapable conclusion drawn from a life of her own struggles. In her narrative, Ryan was not a nephew in need of love and stability, but an additional burden she was incapable of shouldering. This cold logic was more heartbreaking than any anger could have been. It rendered his and his grandmother's bond an irrelevant variable in a cruel equation of resources and responsibilities. The most painful part was hearing his grandmother's spirit break. Miss Marlene, who had been his rock, his entire world, began to plead. Her voice, usually so soft, was now thin and strained, with a desperation that tore through Ryan's heart. He heard her beg Sharon to reconsider, to find another way, to not separate her from her grandson. He heard the raw, unfiltered love in her voice, the sound of a woman fighting for the last precious thing she had in the world. But her pleas were met with gentle, yet immovable dismissals. Sharon's calm, rational tone was a wall against which his grandmother's emotional appeals crashed and dissolved, leaving only the chilling reality of their powerlessness in the face of the decision. The timeline was the final nail in the coffin. Monday morning. The word echoed in Ryan's mind, a death knell for his entire existence. It wasn't a distant threat that might be averted. It was an imminent, scheduled demolition of his life. He had less than 2 days, 48 hours until he would be packed into a car and driven to a strange building full of strange children, while his grandmother would be taken in the opposite direction, to her own place of exile. The abstract horror had been given a date and a time. The ticking of the old clock on the living room wall suddenly sounded deafening, each second a countdown to the moment his world would be irrevocably fractured, the final severing of the only family tie he had left. The finality of the conversation was absolute. After his grandmother's pleas subsided into quiet, defeated sobs, the talk turned to logistics. Sharon spoke of paperwork that needed to be signed, of the items they would be allowed to bring, her voice never wavering from its practical, administrative tone. She was organizing the end of their world as if it were a simple moving day, her focus on the tasks at hand completely detached from the emotional devastation she was causing. To Ryan, listening from the shadows, this was the ultimate confirmation of their insignificance, their love, their history, their shared life. It was all being reduced to a checklist, an inconvenient situation to be managed and filed away by Monday. Soon after, he heard the scrape of a chair, the rustle of a coat, and the final polite goodbyes. The front door opened and closed, and the sound of Sharon Davis's car starting up and driving away was the last sound of the world as he knew it. An oppressive silence descended upon the apartment, broken only by the sound of his grandmother weeping softly in the living room. Ryan remained frozen in the hallway, the overheard words replaying in his mind, branding themselves into his consciousness. The threat was no longer a shadow or a fear. It was a certainty. He was about to lose everything. The quiet, desperate life he had fought so hard to maintain was over, and a future he could not bear to imagine was rushing toward him. For a long time, Ryan remained motionless in the hallway, a silent statue carved from shock. The only sound was the heartbreaking rhythm of his grandmother's weeping from the living room, a sound that seemed to physically erode the walls of the apartment and the fortress around his heart. In that moment, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a heroic decision or a calculated plan born of courage. It was a primal, instinctual recoiling from a future that felt like a cage. The thought of Monday morning, of a strange car arriving to take him to a strange place, was not just a fear. It was an impossibility, an event his entire being refused to accept. He understood with a chilling adult clarity that staying meant surrender. It meant watching his grandmother fade away behind the sterile walls of a nursing home, while he became a number in a system that did not know his name or the sound of his mother's laughter. The decision to run was not a choice. It was the only act of self-preservation he had left. He crept to the edge of the hallway, peering into the living room. Miss Marlene had finally stopped crying. She was slumped in her worn armchair, her body looking smaller and more fragile than ever before. In her lap, she held the old framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day, her thumb gently stroking the glass over their smiling faces. She wasn't looking at it with recognition, but with a distant, vacant sorrow, as if she were mourning ghosts she could no longer name. Seeing her so utterly defeated, so completely broken by the cold practicality of Sharon's visit, solidified Ryan's resolve. He realized she could not fight this battle. The strength she once had was gone, consumed by illness and grief. He was alone in this fight, and the only way to win was to refuse to play the game, to remove himself from the board entirely. Back in his room, his mind began to race, not with a detailed strategy, but with a single overwhelming objective: distance. He went to his window and looked out past the neighboring buildings toward the distant, hazy green line of the Appalachian Mountains, the Monongahela National Forest. It was a place he had only seen on school field trips, a vast, untamed world that felt like the complete opposite of his cramped, suffocating life. The forest represented a place to hide, a place where the rules of social workers and county lines didn't seem to apply. It was an irrational destination, born of a child's logic, but it was the only one that made sense. He would go where they couldn't easily find him. He would disappear into the green, into the quiet, into a world where Monday morning simply could not reach him. His movements became swift and deliberate. He pulled his blue school backpack from the hook on his door, the worn fabric a familiar comfort. He didn't pack for survival, he packed for identity. He carefully wrapped the few photographs he owned, one of his parents, another of his grandmother as a young woman with a vibrant smile, in a t-shirt, and placed them at the bottom. These were the relics of his life, the proof of who he was and where he came from. They were more important than food or water. Then he retrieved the small folded wad of bills from the shoebox under his bed. $20. It felt like a fortune and nothing at the same time. He tucked it deep into an inner pocket, the small bundle of paper representing his only tool, his only resource in the hostile world he was about to enter. A new sound now filled the apartment. The slow, rhythmic breathing of his grandmother, who had finally succumbed to an exhausted, medication-heavy sleep. This was his window. The quiet sound of her rest became a ticking clock, each breath a second slipping away. Ryan stood in the center of his room, listening, every nerve ending alive with tension. The hum of the old refrigerator, the groan of the building's pipes, the distant wail of a siren, every normal sound was now magnified, transformed into a potential threat that could awaken her and bring his desperate plan to a halt. He held his own breath, trying to merge with the silence, to become a ghost in his own home before disappearing from it completely. He was acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine everything, that a single misstep could seal his fate. He slung the backpack over his shoulders, the meager weight feeling immense. He took one last look around his small room. He saw the stack of library books on his nightstand, the faded poster of a planet taped to the wall, the indentation on his pillow where he had slept just last night. This wasn't just a room. It was the entire container of his 11 years of life, a museum of a childhood that was officially ending in this moment. A wave of sorrow, sharp and profound, washed over him, a grief for the home he was being forced to abandon. But beneath it was the cold, hard certainty that this home was already gone. The version he was fighting for had vanished the moment Sharon Davis knocked on their door. He was leaving a memory, a ghost of a life that no longer existed. The front door was the final gatekeeper. He moved through the living room like a shadow, his eyes fixed on the doorknob. He avoided looking at his grandmother, knowing that a single glance at her sleeping form might shatter his resolve. His hand trembled as he reached for the cold metal. He turned the knob with an agonizing slowness, trying to muffle the familiar click of the latch. The sound, when it came, seemed to echo through the silent apartment like a gunshot. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening for any sign that his grandmother had stirred. Hearing only her continued, steady breathing, he pulled the door open just enough to slip through, then gently pushed it shut, the final soft click sealing him out of his own life. Standing in the dim, quiet hallway of the apartment building, the air felt different, charged with a terrifying freedom. He did not look back at the door with his apartment number on it. He didn't dare. Looking back was a luxury he couldn't afford, an act that would invite doubt and paralysis. He simply turned and walked toward the stairwell, his steps quick and sure. With each step down, he felt the suffocating weight of the apartment, of Sharon's words, and of Monday morning beginning to recede, replaced by the sharp electric fear of the unknown. He pushed open the heavy main door and stepped out into the 3 o'clock sun, a solitary figure with a blue backpack, walking away from the only world he had ever known, driven by the desperate hope of outrunning the future. The moment the heavy door of the apartment building clicked shut behind him, the afternoon sun felt unnervingly bright, a stark contrast to the dim, suffocating quiet he had just escaped. For a few disoriented seconds, Ryan simply stood on the cracked pavement, his blue backpack a foreign weight on his shoulders. The ordinary sounds of his neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the laughter of children from a nearby park, the rumble of a passing truck, seemed amplified, alien. He had no plan, no map, no destination beyond the raw primal need to move. His first steps were hesitant, driven by the instinct to simply put distance between himself and the building that contained his entire life. He walked without direction, a small vessel of grief set adrift on a sea of concrete, propelled only by the terrifying certainty that to stop moving was to be caught, to be erased, to be lost forever. He kept to the side streets, his head down, his gaze fixed on the patterns of cracks in the sidewalk. Every familiar landmark was a fresh wound: the corner store where he bought his grandmother's milk, the laundromat that always smelled of warm soap, the small library where he escaped into other worlds. These places were no longer part of his home. They were now artifacts of a life that had ended an hour ago. He walked with a forced, steady pace, trying to look like a boy on his way somewhere specific, a boy with a purpose. But inside, a storm of panic was raging. He imagined his grandmother waking up, finding his room empty, the silence in the apartment turning from peaceful to accusatory. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut that urged him to walk faster, to outrun the image of her confusion and his own overwhelming guilt. A block ahead, he saw Mrs. Gable from the apartment downstairs, walking her small dog. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over him. She would recognize him. She would ask where he was going, why he had his school backpack on a Saturday. She would know something was wrong. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made a sharp, sudden turn into a narrow alleyway between two brick buildings. The air in the alley was cool and smelled of damp garbage. He pressed his back against the rough brick wall, holding his breath, listening to the faint jingle of the dog's collar as it passed the alley's entrance. The moment of potential discovery was a micro-failure, a stark reminder of his vulnerability. He was a fugitive in his own neighborhood, a ghost hiding from the very people who had watched him grow up, his world shrinking to the width of a shadow. Once the sound of the dog's tags faded, he emerged from the alley, his sense of direction now sharpened by fear. He could no longer afford to wander aimlessly. He needed a destination, a place where the logic of adults and social workers could not reach. His eyes lifted from the pavement and scanned the horizon, moving past the low rooftops and telephone poles until they settled on the distant, hazy line of deep green. The Monongahela National Forest. It was a vast, almost mythical place in his mind, a wilderness that promised anonymity. The forest became his beacon, a tangible goal in a world that had dissolved into chaos. It was no longer just a place to hide. It was a sanctuary, a destination that felt both impossibly far and absolutely necessary. The vague idea of escape now had a name and a shape, a green promise of disappearance that pulled him forward with a new, desperate resolve. Reaching the forest on foot was impossible. It was miles away, a journey that would take the rest of the day and expose him for too long. He remembered the city bus route that ran along the main highway, its final stop near the edge of town, closer to the park's entrance. The thought of using his money, his precious $20, was terrifying, but he had no other choice. He navigated the streets with more purpose now, making his way toward the busier thoroughfare where the buses ran. He found a stop and waited, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, pulling the brim of his baseball cap low over his eyes. When the bus hissed to a stop in front of him, he climbed the steps, his hands trembling as he fed his crumpled dollar bills into the machine, avoiding the driver's indifferent gaze. It was a micro-success, a small victory that felt monumental, his first real step into the unknown. The bus was nearly empty, filled with the quiet hum of its engine and the tired sighs of a few afternoon passengers. Ryan slid into a seat by a grimy window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. He watched as his town slid by, the familiar landscape becoming a series of disconnected images. The grocery store, the gas station, the high school, each landmark was a final goodbye. As the bus moved further from the town center, the buildings grew sparse, replaced by fields and small, weathered houses. The world outside the window was transforming, shedding its urban skin and revealing the rural heart of the landscape. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were watching a movie of his own life in reverse, the journey away from home a painful unwinding of every thread that had ever held him in place. The bus driver called out the final stop, his voice echoing in the quiet vehicle. Ryan was the only one who got off. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving him in a cloud of diesel fumes on the shoulder of a two-lane highway. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. In front of him, a weathered wooden sign marked the entrance to the national forest. It felt like a gateway to another world. The air smelled different here, cleaner, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. He stood for a moment, poised on the threshold between the world he was leaving and the one he was about to enter, the sheer scale of the wilderness before him both terrifying and strangely comforting. This was it. This was the point of no return. He walked past the sign and onto a wide, well-trodden trail, but he knew this path was too visible, too easy for anyone to follow. After only 100 yards, he made a critical decision. He veered off the marked trail, pushing his way through a thicket of ferns and into the deeper, untamed woods. The transition was immediate and startling. The canopy of leaves overhead plunged the world into a dim, green-filtered light. The sounds of the highway vanished, replaced by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth and the steady thrum of insects. He was now truly inside, swallowed by the immense living organism of the forest. Every step took him further from the world he knew, each snapping twig under his feet a sound that measured his growing distance from the life he had been forced to abandon. For hours he walked, fueled by a desperate, adrenaline-laced energy. The forest was not a gentle sanctuary. It was a physical adversary. Thorny branches tore at his arms and his jeans, leaving thin red scratches on his skin. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of exposed roots and loose rocks that threatened to twist his ankle with every step. Sweat soaked through his t-shirt, plastering it to his back, and a deep, burning thirst began to build in his throat. He had no water, no food, nothing but the fading photographs in his bag and the dwindling hope that he was putting enough distance between himself and his pursuers. The sun began its slow descent, its light weakening as it filtered through the dense foliage, and the shadows in the forest grew longer and deeper, turning the familiar shapes of trees into monstrous figures. The initial emotional agony of his flight began to recede, replaced by a more primal and immediate set of miseries. The burning in his legs, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, and the sandpaper roughness of his dry tongue became his entire world. The abstract fear of a group home was no match for the immediate physical reality of his exhaustion. He stumbled more frequently, his body refusing to obey the commands of his panicked mind. He was no longer a boy running from his future. He was just a small, tired animal lost in a wilderness that was indifferent to his pain. His desperate forward momentum slowed to a weary shuffle, each step heavier than the last, his will to continue eroding with every labored breath. He was nearing his limit, the point where the body simply gives up. He was on the verge of collapsing, ready to sink to the forest floor and surrender to whatever came next, when he saw it. Through a gap in the dense wall of trees and tangled vines, he caught a glimpse of something unnatural, something man-made. It was the sharp, straight line of a roof, dark and weathered against the chaotic green of the forest. A structure, a house. It was a surreal and impossible sight, an architectural ghost half swallowed by the wilderness. A new kind of energy, born not of adrenaline but of a desperate, flickering curiosity, surged through him. He pushed through one last curtain of thick leaves and stepped into a small clearing, his eyes wide with disbelief. There it was, an old two-story house, completely entwined with the forest, a forgotten relic waiting in the deep, silent woods. The house stood before him not as a building, but as a monument to decay, a sculpture carved by nature itself. It was a two-story structure, its wooden siding weathered to a soft, ghostly grey, almost entirely consumed by a thick blanket of invasive kudzu vines that draped over the roof and walls like a living shroud. The roots of a massive, ancient tree had wrapped themselves around the porch columns, pulling the foundation askew and giving the entire structure the appearance of being slowly dragged back into the earth. For a boy on the brink of collapse, the sight was not terrifying. It was strangely beautiful, a place so thoroughly forgotten by the world that it felt like a sanctuary. His exhaustion was momentarily suspended by a profound sense of disbelief and a powerful, inexplicable feeling that he had found the one place he was supposed to be. He moved cautiously into the small clearing, his feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. The front porch sagged dangerously in the middle, and the steps had long since rotted away, leaving a small, treacherous climb. The front door was still there, its paint peeled away in long strips, but it was blocked by a thick, gnarled root that had forced its way between the door and its frame, sealing it shut decades ago. Yet there was a narrow gap near the hinges, a dark sliver of an opening just wide enough for a small boy to squeeze through. The house seemed to be beckoning him, offering a fragile promise of shelter. The air around it was still and heavy, thick with the smell of wet leaves and rotting wood, the scent of time itself. He felt a primal pull to go inside, a feeling that this forgotten shell was the only thing that could protect him from the world that was hunting him. With a final surge of desperate energy, Ryan forced his way through the narrow opening. The rough, splintered wood of the doorframe scraped against his back, and for a moment he thought he would be stuck. He pushed harder, his breath catching in his chest, and then he was through, tumbling onto a floor soft with layers of decayed leaves and moss. He had crossed a threshold into another world. The air inside was cool and green, the light filtering down from a gaping hole in the roof where the sun pierced the forest canopy. The sounds of the outside world vanished, replaced by an enveloping cathedral-like silence. He was standing in what must have once been a living room, a space now entirely reclaimed, where the border between inside and outside had been completely erased by the patient, relentless work of the forest. His eyes slowly adjusted to the deep green gloom, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. In the very center of the room, where a family might have once gathered, a young sycamore tree grew with defiant strength, its smooth, pale trunk rising from the floorboards and stretching upward toward the light from the hole in the ceiling. Its leaves, a vibrant and impossible green in the dimness, seemed to glow with their own internal light. Ferns and thick patches of moss sprouted from the damp, rotting floor, turning the room into a wild indoor terrarium. It was a scene of such profound and surreal beauty, a perfect and heartbreaking fusion of life and ruin, that it felt less like a discovery and more like a vision, something conjured from the deepest parts of his own fractured spirit. And this is how Ryan Miller arrived at the moment our story began. The sight of that impossible tree, growing so tenaciously in the heart of a dead house, did not inspire fear or wonder. Instead, it triggered a cataclysm of grief inside him. The house, so completely abandoned, so thoroughly forgotten by time, was a perfect mirror of his own soul. He saw his own future in its decaying walls, his own erasure in its vine-choked windows. He was this house, a place that once held a family, now being swallowed by a world that no longer had any use for him. The carefully constructed dam of his emotions, the one that had held back 4 years of loss and a morning of devastating news, finally shattered. A deep, convulsive sob tore from his chest, and he collapsed onto the floorboards, the sound of his weeping the only thing to fill the green-tinged silence of the ruin. After an eternity, the storm of tears subsided, leaving him hollowed out and utterly spent. The frantic energy that had propelled him through the forest was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He sat up slowly, his body aching, and looked around the room with eyes that were no longer clouded by panic. The ruin was no longer a terrifying symbol of his own abandonment. It was just a quiet, peaceful place. For the first time since he had overheard Sharon's voice that morning, he felt a sense of stillness. There was no Monday here. There were no group homes, no nursing homes, no distant cousins making decisions about his life. There was only the gentle light, the silent tree and the slow, patient process of returning to the earth. In this forgotten place, he felt a strange and melancholy sense of belonging, a quiet kinship with the decay that surrounded him. As his senses returned, he began to notice the smaller details of the room. He saw the skeletal remains of a fireplace against one wall, its stone hearth covered in a thick carpet of moss. He saw the ghost of a grand staircase, its lower steps rotted away, leading up into the darkness of a collapsed second floor. And then his eyes were drawn to something else. High on the stone mantel above the fireplace, tucked into a corner and protected from the elements by the overhang, sat a small, dark object. It was too regular in shape to be a piece of wood or a stone. It looked like a box, placed there with intention, just out of reach of the damp and the decay that had claimed everything else. A flicker of curiosity, the first emotion other than fear or grief he had felt all day, sparked within him. He got to his feet, his muscles protesting with a dull ache. The mantel was too high to reach. He looked around the room and found a large, solid piece of a fallen ceiling beam, dragging it over to the fireplace. He climbed onto it, his worn sneakers slipping slightly on the damp wood. Stretching on his toes, his fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface of the object. It was a metal box, heavy and solid, its surface covered in a thick layer of rust. He carefully worked it off the shelf, cradling it in his arms as he stepped back down to the floor. He sat with it in his lap, turning it over in his hands. It was old, sealed shut by time and corrosion. For a moment he hesitated, a sense of trespassing on something sacred, on a history that was not his own. But the need to know, to find some meaning in this place, was stronger. He found a loose stone on the hearth and used it to pry at the rusted lid of the box. It resisted at first, but with a final, sharp crack of metal the seal broke. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. He lifted the lid, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He didn't know what he expected to find: money, a map, some long-lost treasure. But what lay inside was something far more precious and far more heartbreaking. There were no letters, no gold, no explanations. Instead, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried fabric, was a small, neat stack of old black and white photographs, their edges curled with age, but their images still remarkably clear. They were pictures of people, of a family, their smiling faces from a forgotten world, staring up at him from the darkness of the rusty box. He lifted the first photograph from the box, its stiff, aged paper cool against his fingertips. It showed a smiling family of four posing on the very porch he had just climbed, a man with kind eyes, a woman with a warm, gentle expression, and two children, a girl of about 13 and a boy who looked to be 10, the same age as Ryan when his own world had first fractured. He sifted through the others, each a silent, monochrome window into a forgotten time. There was the family having a picnic in the clearing, the boy proudly holding up a fish he had caught, the girl reading a book under the shade of the now gargantuan tree. These were not just images, they were ghosts of a happiness so complete and so ordinary that it felt like a personal accusation, a stark and painful reminder of the life that had been stolen from him, first by a car crash and now by the cold machinery of the state. The initial discovery gave way to a profound and crushing melancholy. The Anderson family, as he would later learn their name was, had not left him a key or a map. They had left a testament to what he had lost. He saw in the face of the young boy in the photographs a reflection of a life he would never know, a life of two parents, of stability, of a home that was a sanctuary rather than a cage of quiet desperation. The house was not a refuge, it was a tomb, and these photos were the epitaph for a family that had simply vanished, just as his was about to. He felt a kinship with the ruin not of hope, but of shared oblivion. He too was a remnant of a family that was disappearing, a boy about to be swallowed by the vast, indifferent forest of the system, leaving behind only faint traces that would eventually fade to nothing. He was about to close the rusted lid, to seal the ghosts back in their metal coffin, when his fingers brushed against the fabric lining the bottom of the box. It felt loose, bunched up in one corner. A flicker of his earlier curiosity returned, a faint spark in the overwhelming darkness of his despair. He pulled at the faded, moth-eaten velvet and felt it give way, revealing not the rusted metal bottom he expected, but a thin, dark piece of wood, It was a false bottom, crafted with care and hidden with intention. This was not just a box of memories left to time. It was a container for a secret. His breath caught in his throat, and the heavy silence of the room seemed to press in on him, charged with a sudden electric potential. This forgotten place had more to say, and he was the first person in decades to be there to listen. With trembling hands, he used the edge of the stone to pry up the wooden panel. It lifted with a soft groan, releasing the faint, dry scent of old paper and leather. Beneath it, nestled in a second hidden compartment, lay two items that would change everything. The first was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by time and touch. The second was a single thick envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with a wax stamp that had long since crumbled. On the front of the envelope, written in an elegant looping script, were 6 simple words that seemed to be addressed directly to him, a message sent across a chasm of 60 years, to the one who found this place. The world outside, with its looming Monday and its group homes, momentarily ceased to exist. His universe had shrunk to the contents of this box. He opened the journal first, its delicate pages whispering as he turned them. The same elegant handwriting filled the book, telling the story of Eleanor Anderson, the mother from the photographs. Her words painted a vivid picture of the life he had only glimpsed in the silent images. She wrote of building the house with her husband David, of planting the garden that was now a riot of wildflowers, of the joy their children, Clara and Thomas, brought into their home. She described Thomas as a boy who loved the forest more than anything, a child with an adventurer's spirit who knew every trail and secret hollow. As Ryan read, the house around him transformed from a ruin into a home. Its silent rooms once again filled with the echoes of laughter and love, a warmth that reached across the decades to touch his own cold, lonely heart. The journal was a love letter to a life of simple, profound happiness. Eleanor wrote about summer nights spent on the porch watching fireflies, of winter mornings huddled by the fireplace, the very one whose mantle had hidden this treasure. She detailed the growth of the sycamore tree in the yard, the one whose descendant was now growing through the living room floor. Every entry was imbued with a deep sense of gratitude and a powerful protective love for her family. Ryan felt an ache of recognition, not for the specifics of her life, but for the feeling that underpinned it. It was the same fierce, all-consuming love he felt for his grandmother, the force that had driven him out into this very wilderness. He was reading the story of a kindred spirit, a heart that understood the desperate need to protect the ones you love. Then, about 3/4 of the way through the journal, the tone shattered. The entries became frantic, stained with the ghostly marks of teardrops. In the fall of 1958, 10-year-old Thomas Anderson had wandered into the woods on a crisp afternoon to explore, just as he had done 100 times before. But on that day he did not come back. Eleanor's neat script devolved into a desperate scrawl as she chronicled the search parties, the sleepless nights, the agonizing slow-motion collapse of hope. The forest, once a place of wonder and beauty for her family, had become a monster, a silent green thief that had stolen her son. The final entry was short, written months later, its words heavy with an unbearable grief. They were leaving the house, she wrote, because it was no longer a home, only a monument to their loss. But the story did not end there. Before leaving, Eleanor wrote of a final act, one born from her own unimaginable pain. She could not bear the thought that another child might ever find themselves lost and alone in these woods, terrified and without hope, as she imagined her Thomas had been in his final hours. She refused to let her grief be a purely destructive force. Instead, she decided to transform her personal tragedy into a promise of sanctuary for a stranger. She and her husband spent their last week in the house, turning it into a secret shelter, a place of last resort for any soul who might stumble upon it, lost and in need of grace. Her words were a revelation, a sudden blinding light in the darkness of Ryan's own despair. This place was not an accident, it was a choice. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ryan carefully broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was from Eleanor, addressed not to her family or her friends, but to him. "If you are reading this," it began, "you are lost, and you are afraid, but I want you to know that you are not alone." She explained that she had left the house as a beacon. She described a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, stocked with tins of food, wool blankets, a box of waterproof matches, and a detailed hand-drawn map that showed a safe, direct path back to the main road. She had created a lifeline, a tangible act of love for a child she would never meet, fueled by the memory of the child she had lost. The house was not an ending. It was a beginning, a place designed to ensure that another family's story did not end in tragedy. The letter was more than just instructions. It was a message of profound human compassion sent across time. "I do not know your story," Eleanor wrote, "but I know that every child deserves to be safe. I know that even in the deepest darkness, a small light can show the way home. Please, use what we have left. Find your way back. Let this place, which was the site of our greatest sorrow, be the source of your rescue." The words blurred as tears streamed down Ryan's face, but these were not the hot, desperate tears he had shed when he first arrived. These were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. He was not a trespasser in a ruin. He was an honored guest in a sanctuary built from a mother's broken heart. Someone 60 years ago had thought of him. Someone had cared enough to leave a light on in the wilderness. He clutched the letter to his chest, the fragile paper a sacred relic. The crushing weight of his isolation, the feeling of being a forgotten problem in an indifferent world, began to lift. In the profound silence of that reclaimed room, he felt a connection not to the ghosts of a lost family, but to the enduring power of a mother's love. Eleanor Anderson, a woman he would never know, had reached through time and saved him. She had not known his name or the circumstances of his flight, but she had known his fear. She had anticipated his need. This act of selfless, anonymous kindness was the most powerful thing he had ever encountered, a force that seemed to push back against the cold, practical cruelty of the world he had fled. He was not alone. This single, impossible discovery reframed his entire reality. The house was no longer a symbol of decay and abandonment. It was a monument to hope and resilience. The sycamore tree growing through the floor was not a sign of nature's victory over man, but a testament to life's stubborn, beautiful insistence on reaching for the light, no matter the circumstances. He understood then that love did not simply vanish when a family was broken. It could echo. It could be passed on. It could become a shelter for a stranger. His desperate, terrified flight had not led him to the end of his world, but to an unbelievable intersection of grief and grace. For the first time since he had heard his cousin's voice that morning, Ryan Miller felt a genuine, unshakable flicker of hope. He now had a map, and he believed, with all his heart, that he could find his way home. The map did not lead Ryan back to the highway. Instead, it guided him to a lesser-known ranger trail that intersected with a quiet county road. It was there, on Sunday morning, that a search and rescue volunteer found him, a small, exhausted figure walking with a strange new resolve. His return, however, did not bring the immediate relief he had imagined. When Miss Marlene saw him, safe but covered in scratches and dirt, the fragile dam of her own emotions broke. The terror of the last 24 hours, coupled with her own failing health, culminated in a physical collapse, and she was rushed to the hospital. For 3 agonizing days, Ryan stayed with his neighbor, Miss Celia Martinez, trapped in a new kind of limbo. The system he had tried to outrun had found him, and a social worker named Beatrice Campbell was assigned to his case. The future he had fought so desperately to escape seemed once again inevitable, a cold, administrative certainty waiting just beyond the hospital doors. It was within the sterile white walls of that hospital that the true nature of their struggle was finally brought to light. Beatrice Campbell was not a bureaucrat, but a careful and compassionate investigator. In speaking with Miss Marlene's doctors and reviewing their sparse financial records, she uncovered the heartbreaking truth that had been hidden behind their quiet desperation. Miss Marlene was severely malnourished, her diabetes dangerously out of control, not from neglect, but from a quiet, devastating self-sacrifice. She had been foregoing her own expensive medication and skipping meals to ensure Ryan had enough to eat, prioritizing his well-being over her very survival. This single powerful revelation changed everything. Ryan was not the victim of a neglectful guardian. He was the beneficiary of a love so profound it was willing to destroy itself. Armed with this understanding, Beatrice began to activate the social safety nets that had always existed, but had remained just out of reach for a family too isolated to ask for help. Ryan did not go to a group home. He went back to his own apartment, but it was a home transformed. The quiet desperation had been replaced by a structure of tangible support. Through Medicaid, a home care nurse began visiting 3 times a week to manage Miss Marlene's health. The SNAP program ensured their pantry was always full, and a low-cost pharmacy plan meant his grandmother no longer had to choose between her insulin and their dinner. Miss Celia, their neighbor, became a daily presence, a warm and steady friend who checked in on them and shared meals. The crushing weight of responsibility that had aged Ryan beyond his years was finally lifted, distributed among a community and a system that was now working as it should. The threat of separation had been vanquished not by a desperate flight into the woods, but by the quiet, methodical application of human empathy and social infrastructure. 5 years later, at 16, Ryan Miller is a young man who knows the value of an ordinary day. He studies, works a part-time job in a youth apprenticeship program, and still shares the small apartment with his grandmother, whose health has stabilized under consistent care. The house in the forest remains a powerful, pivotal memory, but its meaning has changed. It was not a magical shelter that offered a solution, but a catalyst, the desperate act that finally made their invisible struggle visible to the outside world. He learned that salvation rarely comes from a secret map or a forgotten treasure, but from the quiet resilience of the human spirit and the profound intervention of a community that chooses to care. The greatest victory of his life was not escaping his fate, but earning the simple, precious right to continue living a normal life, a future that once seemed as distant